M. Lakshmikant, picking up from our last discussion, we've now moved into the East India Company. Can you give us a concise overview of their transformation?
Sure. Initially, traders, the East India Company, got exclusive trading rights. But the Diwani rights.
The Diwani rights? Could you elaborate on that?
Imagine the Diwani rights as essentially the tax collecting and judicial powers. In 1765, they got the right to collect revenue and administer justice in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. That's a huge leap from simply trading.
So, the company became a political entity, not just a commercial one. What were some of the consequences?
Well, you saw the shift from just commerce to a de facto ruling power. They started to collect taxes, raise armies, and impose their own laws, ultimately wielding more influence than the local rulers.
And what do you see as a major turning point in this trajectory?
Absolutely, the Sepoy Mutiny. It was a major upheaval.
But what led to that mutiny?
Well, complex factors, but the issues of greed and resentment over policies regarding arms and religious issues played a large part. This was a turning point, ushering in the Crown rule.
So, you're saying the Crown took over, replacing the company. What did that actually entail?
Yes, the Crown assumed direct control over India's governance in 1858. It was a significant shift in power.
What is the legacy of this, Lakshmikant?
It definitely significantly altered the course of Indian history, influencing our constitution in ways we still see today.
Fascinating. We'll dive deeper into those constitutional links next time. Lakshmikant, picking up where we left off, the Regulating Act of 1773. What precisely did this act do?
Well, it was a watershed moment, Vansh. A direct response to the growing concerns about the East India Company's unchecked power.
Unchecked? Can you give some examples?
Sure. Corruption, conflicts of interest, the company's interests were not always aligned with the needs of the Indian people under their control. They weren't exactly playing fair.
So, what was the core of this act?
The act aimed to rein in the company's actions. It was the first attempt by the British government to control the company's affairs in India.
How did this control work?
It established a Governor-General of Bengal, and placed the governors of Bombay and Madras under his authority. Think of it like bringing different branches of a company under one umbrella management.
So, centralization. That's a big deal, right?
Exactly. It was the first step towards creating a more unified administrative system in India. It also set up a Supreme Court.
A Supreme Court? What was its role?
A Supreme Court in Calcutta. It oversaw justice, and that was crucial.
Why was it needed in this context?
The act recognized the company's political and administrative role, so a legal framework was needed to deal with disputes.
So, the act was more than just about control. It was about establishing legal frameworks.
Precisely. It also restricted company servants from engaging in private trade or accepting bribes.
So, it aimed at reducing corruption?
Yes, and it required the company to report on its financial and administrative affairs, ensuring transparency. It was a significant attempt.
So, this act was a key turning point in the relationship between the British government and the East India Company?
Absolutely. It laid the groundwork for future regulations.
Lakshmikant, what are some of the long-term impacts of this act?
Well, it laid the foundation for a centralized government. The impact was felt even into India's constitutional development.
Very interesting indeed.
It was very significant for the history of India.
Thanks, Lakshmikant. That was really enlightening. Lakshmikant, following up on the Regulating Act, we now have the Amending Act of 1781. What were the key changes?
Well, it aimed to fix issues with the previous act. Essentially, it wanted to balance the relationship between the company, the British government, and Indian laws.
Sounds tricky. Can you give some examples?
Sure. The Supreme Court had too much power under the Regulating Act, so they restricted its jurisdiction over company officials in their official roles.
A bit like a corporation limiting the reach of government oversight?
Sort of. They also excluded revenue collection from the Supreme Court's domain.
So, the company retained more control over finances?
Precisely. It also required the court to apply Hindu and Muslim personal law in cases. A tough balancing act.
This was attempting to integrate different legal systems?
Yes, and appeals were now going to the Governor-General rather than the court. A power shift.
What was the rationale behind limiting the Supreme Court?
The court, in some cases, wasn't always understanding local customs and laws. It could create problems.
So, there were complaints about the Supreme Court's approach?
Exactly. Also, the earlier act had some unintended consequences. The amendments tried to limit those negative outcomes.
Was this a step towards greater Indian autonomy or more British control?
A complex issue. It certainly strengthened the position of the Governor-General, but also preserved aspects of local law.
Were there any unintended consequences?
Well, implementing different legal systems could lead to conflicts.
So, this act shows the British attempting to navigate a complicated situation.
A fine line between control and fairness.
Fascinating. Thank you, M. Lakshmikant.
You're welcome.
M. Lakshmikant, building on the Amending Act, we now move to the Pitt's India Act of 1784. What's significant about this one?
Well, it's a major step toward centralizing British control. It created a double government system.
Double government? Can you elaborate?
Splitting the East India Company's power. The Court of Directors handled commerce.
And?
A new Board of Control managed political affairs. A key change.
So, two entities controlling the same territory?
Yes, essentially. British government now had a say in how the company ruled.
This system, was it a good model?
Challenging to implement, you know. Centralization, a power shift.
So, the British government was getting more control?
A lot more. The Act also formally called Indian territories British possessions.
Wow, that's a profound statement.
It was a significant power shift.
What are the unintended consequences?
The company's commercial interests potentially hampered.
Was the company happy?
Probably not thrilled, you know.
How did this affect Indian governance?
Eroded Indian influence.
How so?
Reduced local autonomy.
But at the same time, the British government?
Was ensuring stability through control.
A very subtle, yet powerful, shift?
You could say that.
What do you think of the system in the long run?
Complex, and impactful.
The act marked a significant turning point?
Indeed.
Thanks, M. Lakshmikant.
Welcome.
M. Lakshmikant, following the Pitt's Act, we see Lord Cornwallis stepping in. What sparked this move?
Well, he wanted more power, you see.
More power? Why? Was the earlier system too cumbersome?
Exactly. He felt he needed more authority, and the Act of 1786 granted it.
So, what did the Act of 1786 do specifically?
Gave him the power to override council decisions, and he became commander-in-chief.
Override? Like veto power, you mean?
Essentially, yes. A significant shift.
Why was that needed? What were the circumstances?
Well, you know, complex situations, fast-moving issues.
Like what? Could you provide some examples?
Decisions involving strategy, for example, or urgent issues.
So effectively a stronger hand.
You could say that. But it also altered the balance of power in the administration.
So, this Act of 1786, how did it affect the company?
Well, it concentrated power in the hands of the Governor-General.
Impact on the local populations?
Potential issues, you know, depending on how this power was wielded.
Increased control, but at what cost?
That's a valid question.
Was this a beneficial move for India?
Complex situation. Potentially led to stability.
But at what cost to local autonomy?
That was always a delicate balance.
So, this further solidified British presence?
You could say so.
Thanks, M. Lakshmikant.
You're welcome.
M. Lakshmikant, the Act of 1786 isn't just about Cornwallis. It sets a precedent, right?
Exactly. The overriding power extends to all future governors.
So, a more permanent shift in power dynamics. How did this affect the other presidencies, Bombay and Madras?
The Governor-General now held more sway over them. Increased control.
Did this lead to more efficient governance, or was it a problem?
That's a complex question. Potentially more efficient administration, but maybe at the cost of local autonomy.
What about the trade monopoly extension? 20 more years?
Yes, extended for another 20 years.
Was that good for India's economy?
Hard to say. It maintained British control, but stifled local enterprise.
Separate commander-in-chief?
No longer a council member, unless appointed.
Was that a positive move for military strategy?
Different perspectives, potentially. More direct control, but less collaborative planning.
M. Lakshmikant, the Board controls funding from Indian revenue. How did that change things?
Shift of responsibility to India, arguably.
Was this seen as more accountable, or
more complex relationship?
Was there any pushback from Indian merchants?
Probably, but historical records might not reflect it fully.
So, increased centralization, but at what cost?
Certainly a trade-off. A different balance of power.
Interesting. A permanent ripple effect.
Potentially.
Think about this in terms of a company. If you give the CEO more control over local branches,
the branches become less independent.
Exactly. So, M. Lakshmikant, what's your overall assessment of the long-term impact?
Complex, long-term effects. Could have created a degree of stability.
But definitely at the cost of local input.
Yes, a delicate balancing act.
Great discussion, M. Lakshmikant.
Thanks, Vansh.
M. Lakshmikant. Wow, this Act of 1793 introduces a whole new level of complexity. It seems to move away from pure centralization, doesn't it?
Yes, there's a shift. The trade monopoly is abolished, mostly, opening up Indian trade to more British merchants. However, some key areas remain controlled.
So, more free trade, but with caveats?
Exactly. The Crown asserts dominance over the company's territories. It's a step towards more direct control.
How did this affect Indian merchants? Were they in favor of this change?
Well, some might have benefited, but it also presented new challenges. Competition intensified, and it's difficult to know the exact impact in the 1790s.
And the missionaries? This opens the door for them, right?
The Act allows Christian missionaries. This was controversial, naturally.
Could you elaborate on the controversy?
It's a clash of cultures and beliefs. Some saw it as enlightening, others as a threat to existing traditions.
What about local governments gaining taxing powers? Empowering them? Or another layer of British control?
It's a bit of both. Increased revenue for local authorities but potentially under British oversight.
Imagine this, giving a local branch more control over taxes. Sounds like more autonomy, right?
Not necessarily full autonomy. British influence might still be prevalent.
So, was this opening a window of opportunity for some local growth? Or were they just controlled by another means?
Very complex, Vansh. Definitely a mixed bag of outcomes.
Was there any pushback from local rulers?
Possibly. Historical records might not fully reflect it, though.
Opening up trade? Does it always mean good things?
Free trade can be very destabilizing for established economic structures.
So a lot of subtleties here. It's not a simple shift, is it?
No, the situation is much more nuanced.
Is there anything you can tell me about how local people reacted to Western education?
Mixed reception. Some embraced it, some viewed it with suspicion.
Fascinating. So many angles to consider.
Indeed.
Great insights, M. Lakshmikant. M. Lakshmikant. Following up on 1793, this 1833 Act seems to be a significant tightening of the British grip.
Yes, Vansh. It's a complete centralization. The Governor-General of India, all-powerful.
So, the Governor-General is now the ultimate authority?
Exactly. All civil and military powers concentrated in one person.
So, that's a major shift from the previous setup, right?
Absolutely. It's a move towards a more unified system of control over the whole territory.
And the company, how is their role changing?
They are losing their commercial functions, becoming purely administrative.
What was that like from a business perspective, for the company?
Huge change. Loss of revenue from trade, major shift from their core activity.
How did this shift impact the Indian economy?
Hard to say. Some believe it stifled Indian trade, while others see opportunities for British industry to expand.
Interesting. How did the change to acts from regulations affect the Indian people?
The legal system evolved. It consolidated laws and created a more defined legal structure.
So, greater bureaucracy, but also a more systemized approach?
Yes, Vansh, more formal and less localized.
What about the supposed attempt at open competition for civil service jobs?
It was there, in theory, but was quickly opposed by the company.
So, thwarted by self-interest?
Precisely.
So, all this centralization, good for British control, but what about India's own development?
A complex question. It led to significant political restructuring, but also debate about Indian autonomy.
The impact of 1833 is definitely open to different interpretations, isn't it?
Definitely, Vansh. It brought about substantial administrative changes, but the long-term impact on India is a complicated story.
What are some key aspects of the legal changes?
The shift to acts provided a clearer and more unified legal framework for the vast territory.
So, an important consolidation of governance.
Exactly.
Fascinating details. Thanks, M. Lakshmikant. M. Lakshmikant, you mentioned 1853 as a significant landmark. What makes it so?
Well, Vansh, it significantly altered the structure of governance.
How so?
This act separated legislative and executive functions for the first time.
Wow. Why was that important?
It created a separate legislative council, a mini-parliament.
So, a more formalized, structured approach?
Precisely. They even adopted British parliamentary procedures.
So, we're seeing more formalization of the system and greater separation of powers.
Yes.
And what about the civil service reforms?
The act introduced open competition.
So, finally Indians could apply?
Theoretically, yes. The Macaulay Committee followed.
How did that change things?
It opened avenues for Indian participation.
But was it actually open?
Well, Vansh, the specifics of the criteria are debated.
It sounds like potentially problematic implementation.
Yes. There were definite limitations.
And the extension of the company's rule?
Indefinite.
So, no set expiration date?
No. Which means, potential for indefinite British control.
That seems significant.
Also, local representation was introduced.
So, provinces had a voice in the central government?
Yes, for members from different provinces.
So, that 1853 Act was a step towards a more accountable, multifaceted approach to governing India.
In some ways. But still very much with British oversight.
So a more nuanced control structure.
Yes, Vansh. A more formalized and potentially, in time, more representative system, with limitations, of course.
Fascinating. Thanks, M. Lakshmikant.
You're welcome.
Okay, M. Lakshmikant, we just discussed the 1853 Act. Now, let's jump to 1858. What triggered that significant change?
The 1857 revolt, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, was a major turning point.
Right? A major rebellion. So, the British responded?
Absolutely. The Act of 1858 effectively ended the East India Company's rule.
Wow. So, a complete shift in power.
Yes, Vangsh, power was transferred to the British Crown. That's a huge deal.
And how did the administrative structure change?
The Governor-General became the Viceroy, a direct representative of the Crown.
Interesting. A different title, different relationship.
Exactly. And the Board of Control and Court of Directors were abolished.
So, no more of that indirect control.
No, a single, unified structure under the Secretary of State for India.
A new position, Secretary of State? What was their role?
Very powerful, responsible to Parliament, complete control over India's administration.
Wow. Centralized control.
Yes, with a Council of India to advise.
Advisory, but still. Power concentrated?
Essentially, Vangsh. The Viceroy, the Secretary of State.
It feels like they're consolidating power, taking direct charge.
Indeed, Vangsh.
So, was this just a reaction to the rebellion, or was it a broader strategy?
Likely a combination, Vangsh. The rebellion underscored the need for a more efficient, centralized administration.
You mean to prevent future revolts, as well?
Perhaps.
I mean, how did India react to this new structure?
Well, reactions were complex. Some saw it as an attempt to maintain control, while others, of course, viewed the change with concern.
Fascinating. So, the 1858 Act was a decisive move towards direct British control?
Precisely, a direct centralized structure aimed to maintain order and stability, but
what about the potential drawbacks?
Inefficiency, lack of local input.
It's a trade-off. Okay, Lakshmikant, we just saw how the 1858 Act consolidated British control. Now, 1861? A shift, right?
Yes, a subtle but significant shift. The British saw a need to involve Indians, to some extent.
Involve? How so?
The Indian Councils Act of 1861, it introduced representation.
Representation? For Indians?
Nominated Indians to legislative councils.
So, a small step towards participation?
A very small step. Viceroy nominating non-official Indians.
Who were some early members?
The Raja of Benares, Patiala Dinkar Rao, early attempts.
Limited though. Nominated, not elected.
Absolutely. It was largely advisory.
And decentralization?
Restored legislative powers to Bombay and Madras. A reaction to earlier centralization.
A pushback?
A bit. Provinces got more autonomy.
So, 1861 was about both inclusion and control?
Precisely, a balancing act.
Interesting. The portfolio system, what's that?
Viceroy's council members handled specific departments.
More responsibility, less centralized power?
More efficient distribution, yes.
So, 1861 gave some administrative reforms, but also emergency powers. How?
Viceroy could issue ordinances without council.
Limited representation, decentralization, some administrative reform, but also clear limits.
The act reflects a complex colonial strategy, Vangsh.
So, how successful was it? Did the Indian Councils Act 1861 really work to achieve its objectives?
Well, success is relative, Vangsh. It gave the appearance of involvement without fundamentally shifting the power dynamics. In my view, a tool to manage potential challenges, manage dissent.
Did it quell dissent? Lakshmikant?
Not completely, definitely not entirely.
Very interesting. Thank you, Lakshmikant.
You're welcome, Vansh.
Okay, Lakshmikant. So 1892, building on 1861. More Indian voices, right?
Yes, but still firmly within a British framework. More non-official members, that's the key.
More voices, but still under British rule.
Exactly. Officially, a wider representation, but the British still held the majority.
Wider representation. How wider?
Legislative councils got the power to discuss the budget, ask questions.
Now they could actually challenge the executive?
Well, challenge, in a limited way. It was a gradual shift.
So, this nomination process, it's a bit tricky, right?
Indeed. Nominated on recommendation from various groups. District boards, universities.
So, wasn't it just favoring certain elites?
Potentially. There's a fine line between representation and maintaining control.
You mean, picking who's allowed to represent?
Exactly. It wasn't about universal suffrage.
And the word election wasn't used. It's a subtle difference.
You bet. A calculated omission.
So, the debates, did they really make a difference?
It's hard to say. Some progress towards real dialogue, but British ultimately held the cards.
So, 1892 built upon 1861, but not that much further than that?
Exactly, Vansh. A careful expansion of a carefully constructed system.
So, what motivated the British to expand representation?
A combination of factors: appeasement, managing dissent, and potentially recognizing growing Indian nationalist sentiment.
That's a very delicate balance.
Precisely.
So, were Indian elites truly benefiting from this?
Complex, Vansh. Some clearly gained influence. But it was definitely not a democratic process.
So, incremental changes? But was it real change?
The question of intent and effectiveness lingers. Difficult to define clear success.
Fascinating. Thanks, Lakshmikant.
You're welcome, Vansh.
Lakshmikant, 1909, a big leap from 1892, right?
Absolutely. We see a dramatic increase in the size of legislative councils. Provincially, even a non-official majority.
So a much bigger Indian presence officially.
Yes, with expanded functions as well, to move budget resolutions, ask supplementary questions. It was a significant shift.
So, Indians were really getting a say now?
Not quite. While the presence of Indians in councils increased, the British still held the official majority in the center, maintaining crucial control.
And then this communal representation?
A pivotal point. Separate electorates for Muslims were introduced, a system where Muslims voted only for Muslim candidates.
So, this was intentionally divisive?
Critics certainly argued so. It was potentially seen as a way to divide the nationalist movement. A calculated strategy of divide and rule, some historians argue.
Interesting. How did Indians react?
Reactions were varied. Some saw it as a step toward addressing the concerns of specific communities, while others viewed it as a means to sow discord.
So, was this good for India?
Complex. It allowed for the inclusion of different voices, but potentially at the expense of unity.
And Indians in the executive councils?
Yes, a significant step. For example, Satyendra Prasad Sinha became a law member. Yet, it was still within the framework of British administration.
So progress, but still within limitations.
Precisely. It was a careful calibration of power, trying to satisfy various groups.
What motivated the British?
A mix of factors. Managing potential unrest, trying to include specific communities, and maintaining control.
A fascinating balancing act.
Yes, a delicate dance between granting some power and retaining significant control.
So, did these legislative debates lead to real change in policy?
It's tough to say. Indian influence did increase, yet a significant part of actual policy-making still resided with the British.
So, 1909 a step forward, but definitely with a catch?
Absolutely. It was a moment of complex realities.
Thanks, M. Lakshmikant. That's really helpful.
You're welcome, Vansh.
M. Lakshmikant, 1919, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, another step, right?
Absolutely, Vansh. Significant, but complicated. We see a further shift in power, though central control remained.
So more Indian involvement?
Yes, but with this diarchy thing, this dual administration. It's like a power-sharing arrangement, but with strings attached.
Explain diarchy?
Provinces divided subjects into transferred and reserved. Transferred subjects, handled by ministers responsible to the legislature. Reserved subjects, under direct British control.
So, a partial handover?
Exactly. Potentially a step towards more self-governance, but far from complete independence.
Bicameralism too. Why the shift?
Well, the Act introduced a bicameral legislature, which means two houses. This was intended to enhance representation, but its success is debatable.
More communal representation too, right?
Yes. Extended to Sikhs, Indian Christians, and others. The seeds of future problems. The British strategy, often seen as divisive.
Why do you say seeds of future problems?
It deepened social divisions along communal lines.
And the franchise still quite limited. Why?
Property, tax, or education qualifications. Limited voting rights to a few. A big issue.
So, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, despite the steps, felt unfulfilled for Indians?
Exactly, Vansh. It was a step, but not a giant leap. It maintained the core structures of colonial rule.
Any specific examples of how this worked in the provinces?
Well, provinces differed greatly. Some found successes in certain areas, but diarchy often created bureaucratic hurdles.
Ultimately, a sort of compromise rather than real change?
Exactly. A balancing act to manage expectations and maintain control.
Thanks, M. Lakshmikant. This provides a great perspective.
You're welcome, Vansh.
M. Lakshmikant, moving on to 1935, a more substantial effort, right?
Yes, Vansh. A massive undertaking. It attempted a huge leap toward responsible government, with 321 sections.
So, the federation idea, what was that about?
A proposed union of provinces and princely states. The intent was great, a unified India. But the princely states were wary.
Why the hesitation?
Fear of losing autonomy, differences in governance styles, many political factors played a role.
And the effort at central diarchy failed?
Completely. The provinces, though, gained autonomy, didn't they?
So, more power for provinces?
Exactly. But the period it lasted wasn't very long.
More provinces got bicameralism. Why was that important?
Enhancing representation, but with constraints, it's a complex story. More branches, different viewpoints, but limitations remained.
Communal representation expanded further. That's interesting.
Yes, including depressed classes, women, and laborers. The complexities were further amplified by that.
What, in your opinion, was the biggest flaw in this act?
The federation failing. The princely states didn't join, fundamentally weakening the intent. And the limited tenure of provincial autonomy.
So, did this act move India closer to self-rule?
It was a complex answer. More power to the provinces, yes. But the lack of a unified federation hampered that. And the long-term consequences of communal representation? Well, that's another story.
It was interesting. All these reforms, a constant tug-of-war, right?
Precisely. A constant struggle between British control and the growing nationalist aspirations.
Thanks, M. Lakshmikant. Great insight.
You're welcome, Vansh.
Okay, M. Lakshmikant, 1947. The culmination, right? The moment of independence.
Absolutely, Vansh. A monumental shift. The Indian Independence Act of 1947.
So, this act, what did it do exactly?
Well, it ended British rule, declared India independent on August 15, 1947. But it also partitioned the country into two dominions, India and Pakistan.
Partition, that was a massive decision.
Extremely complex. The Muslim League agitated for it.
So, the seeds were sown way back.
Yes. The issues of communal representation in earlier acts created significant tensions that the 1947 Act had to address.
How did the 1935 Act play a role?
It created a framework that laid a template for this, unfortunately. It served as a temporary form of governance until the new constitutions were ready. The Act was meant to be temporary.
So, the new nations were born. But what about governance?
The Act provided for governor-generals, initially appointed by the British monarch, but with significant power limitations.
So, significant change?
Their roles were largely ceremonial. The new assemblies were empowered to make and shape their own constitutions.
How did the British finally leave?
The 1947 Act established a clear timeframe. By August 15, 1947, the power transferred.
What about the princely states?
The Act acknowledged their independence and freedom to join either dominion or remain separate. This had huge impact in the years to come.
A lot going on. Was it a smooth process?
Not at all. The partition itself was terribly violent, you know. The Act was only a framework.
Ultimately, the 1947 Act, was it successful?
Well, it was a step toward independence. But the partition created many problems, which still resonate today.
Interesting. Thanks for your insights, M. Lakshmikant.
You're welcome, Vansh.
Okay, M. Lakshmikant, so the 1947 Act was the end result. But what were the building blocks leading up to it?
Absolutely. The idea of a constituent assembly, you know, wasn't born overnight.
So, tell me who first suggested it.
Amenesbility, a communist leader, proposed it way back in 1934. The Congress picked it up in 1935.
And why was this important?
It was about framing India's own constitution, independent of British influence. Nehru, in 1938, famously said it should be elected by adult franchise.
So the British were just sitting on their hands?
Not exactly. There were offers and proposals. The August offer of 1940, for instance, accepted the principle in principle.
And the Cripps proposals?
Cripps came with a draft, in 1942. But the Muslim League rejected it. They wanted separate constituent assemblies.
Wow, that complicates things.
It did. The League felt excluded. And then the cabinet mission came along.
What was the cabinet mission?
A team from the British government. They presented a proposal, which, although not fully what the Muslim League wanted regarding separate assemblies, did address some of their concerns.
So, the Muslim League ultimately agreed?
Essentially, yes. The mission scheme satisfied them enough to support a unified constituent assembly.
So, that was the key, finding a way to satisfy everyone?
Yes. Finding a common ground amongst such diverse interests, and a complex political environment, was a difficult task.
Fascinating. So a long road, and eventually, the path was paved for the Constituent Assembly.
Exactly. And the groundwork was fundamental to the Indian Independence Act itself.
What a fascinating journey. Thanks for that historical perspective.
You're very welcome.
Okay, I'm Lakshmikant. So we've talked about the cabinet mission plan leading to the Constituent Assembly. Now, what exactly was this assembly?
Well, it was a pretty unique body. Formed in November 1946.
And how is it made up?
It had 389 members, 296 from British India, 93 from princely states.
So, different representation.
Exactly. Provinces got seats based on population. And within British India, seats were divided amongst Muslims, Sikhs and others proportionally.
Indirectly elected?
Yep. Members from provinces were chosen by members of their provincial assemblies. So, indirectly elected by people on a limited franchise.
So a bit convoluted.
Absolutely. The Congress won 208, the Muslim League, 73.
Interesting. And princely states?
Didn't participate fully. They chose not to.
Why do you think that might have been?
Well, complex relationships with the British government, their own internal politics.
So, it wasn't a fully democratic body?
Not in the same way as a directly elected assembly based on universal adult franchise.
But it was representative of many groups.
Absolutely, encompassing Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and all those different communities. Even women.
So, a fair mix of voices?
The most important personalities, except Gandhi, were included.
Wow! What about specific voting methods?
They used proportional representation, single transferable vote.
So, a fascinating journey in shaping a nation.
It really was. The indirect election was a method of finding a common ground amidst so many competing interests, though not fully democratic.
So, a compromise essential at the time?
Yes, an important compromise.
Fascinating. Thanks for explaining it so well.
My pleasure.
So, the first meeting of the Assembly, what happened there?
Well, December 9, 1946, was quite significant. The Muslim League boycotted it.
Boycotted it? Why?
They wanted a separate Pakistan. Only 211 members attended.
So, a crucial beginning, but not as full as it could have been.
Right. Dr. Sachidananda Sinha became temporary president.
That's interesting. French practice?
Yes.
Now this objectives resolution, what was that?
A key document laid the philosophical foundation of the future constitution.
Like a blueprint?
Exactly. It declared India a sovereign republic.
So important.
It outlined basic rights, the structure, etc.
Wow.
Unanimously adopted on January 22, 1947. Crucially shaped the Constitution.
So, it wasn't just a meeting, it was a declaration.
Precisely.
How did the Assembly's role change later?
The Independence Act of 1947 made it a legislative body.
A legislative body?
It could make ordinary laws, alongside drafting the Constitution.
Wow, 2 roles.
Chaired by different presidents for each role.
Interesting.
The Assembly became the first Dominion legislature.
That's a huge change. Why was that necessary?
Well.
I mean the Muslim League withdrawal, right? It affected the numbers?
Yes. The act also affected the number of seats from provinces and princely states.
So, the Assembly evolved with India's political evolution.
Absolutely. Adopted the flag, anthem, and elected Prasad.
Remarkable.
Did you know it had 11 sessions?
Wow.
The making of a constitution, you know, a huge process.
Indeed, a nation taking shape.
It continued as provisional parliament too.
Very insightful, thanks.
My pleasure.
Okay, I'm Kant, so we've looked at the Assembly as a whole. Now, how did the actual work of drafting the Constitution get done?
They established many committees. Think of it like a giant project with specialized teams.
Specialized teams? Like what?
For instance, a Union Powers Committee, a Provincial Constitution Committee, and the famous Drafting Committee.
The Drafting Committee, now that sounds important.
Absolutely. Headed by Dr. Ambedkar, it had 7 members, including some great legal minds.
So, why so many committees?
Well, the task was enormous. It helped divide the monumental work into smaller, more manageable tasks.
What were their tasks? Could you give us an example?
The Union Powers Committee looked at the powers of the central government.
Makes sense.
And the Drafting Committee wrote the actual draft of the Constitution. Quite a feat, considering the size and complexity.
How long did it take?
The Drafting Committee worked remarkably fast, producing a first draft within 6 months.
Impressed. How did the committee work, exactly?
They considered suggestions from other committees, public input, etc. It was an iterative process.
So, they were constantly refining things?
Yes. Public input and discussions influenced the final form.
A public-driven process?
Precisely.
That's fascinating. And the people involved?
Each committee was led by exceptional figures like Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
So important. A powerhouse of experts.
Exactly. The Constitution was the product of collective effort, and the committees were its framework.
That's incredibly significant. How do you see it from a historical perspective?
It was a testament to India's commitment to democratic processes, and the committees were truly the heart of it all. A great example of teamwork.
Amazing. We've touched on many important details. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, Lakshmikant. So the drafting was done, but what was the process of actually adopting the Constitution?
Well, it went through 3 readings.
3 readings? Like in a bill?
Exactly. First reading, general discussion.
How long did that take?
5 days.
That sounds pretty quick considering the document.
It was a fast-paced process. Lots of amendments, too.
Wow. How many?
Over 7,000 proposed, 2,473 discussed.
So many ideas. Interesting.
Second reading was clause by clause, a meticulous process.
A very careful one. How long did that take?
Almost 3.5 months.
Wow. And the final reading?
Dr. Ambedkar moved the final motion.
And when was that?
November 14, 1949. It was passed on November 26.
And how many signed it?
Out of 299 members, 284 signed.
What an achievement.
Indeed. And there was a preamble added later, after the entire thing was approved.
Interesting. So the preamble came last?
Yes, it was a crucial addition.
So, was that discussion quick? Did they miss anything?
Well, it was a time-sensitive process, and they did make trade-offs to ensure completion within a reasonable time frame.
Important point.
Absolutely. Dr. Ambedkar was the key figure driving this.
A huge undertaking.
Yes, a testament to a great leader and to India's commitment to democracy.
Makes sense.
A huge moment.
So, the Constitution was adopted on November 26, 1949, but when did it actually start working?
Well, not all at once. Some parts, like citizenship and elections, started right away.
Wow. Specific sections came into force immediately? That's interesting. Why not all at once?
There were temporary and transitional provisions. Think of it like setting up a new government. Some things need immediate attention, others can wait until the full infrastructure is in place.
So, the big parts, the bulk of it, when did those kick in?
January 26, 1950. The day of commencement. A big deal historically.
Why was that date chosen?
It was a key day in India's struggle for independence, marking the Purna Swaraj Day of 1930. A powerful symbolic choice.
That's a really neat connection. So, what laws were replaced by the Constitution?
The 1947 Independence Act, the 1935 Government of India Act, and all the amendments to it.
So, a complete overhaul.
Pretty much. But the Abolition of Privy Council Jurisdiction Act stayed in place.
Why was that one kept?
You know, often when you replace laws, certain things need to be handled smoothly. Maintaining existing legal continuity was likely part of that.
Makes sense. So, did these changes affect the everyday lives of people?
Absolutely. The 1935 Act was heavily impacting the structure of the government in India. Citizens gained rights and the fundamental framework for the country was laid.
Wow, a lot of change.
A huge moment in Indian history.
That's pretty amazing. How would you summarize the historical significance of that date, January 26th?
Symbolically, it connected the present to a significant moment of struggle and transition.
So that's why the Republic Day was chosen for it, right?
Exactly. It was a moment to celebrate this critical juncture.
Impressive. A lot packed into those dates. So, we've seen how the Constitution officially kicked in, but what was happening behind the scenes?
Absolutely. Before the actual document took effect, a crucial committee got to work.
A committee? Tell us more.
The Congress Party formed an experts committee. It was super important in setting things up.
Who were the key players? Any familiar names?
Jawaharlal Nehru chaired it, along with people like Asaf Ali and K.M. Munshi. You know, some very influential figures.
So, what did this committee actually do?
They laid the groundwork. They looked at how the Constituent Assembly should function, planned various committees, and even drafted the Objectives Resolution.
The Objectives Resolution? What's that?
It was a statement outlining India's fundamental goals. Essentially, the vision for the new nation.
Wow. That's significant. How did this committee contribute, specifically, to the final constitution?
Well, experts like Granville Austin have noted that this committee essentially guided India towards its present constitution. They had input on important topics like state autonomy and the center's powers.
It sounds like this committee was instrumental. What were the debates, if any, surrounding the composition and functions of this particular committee?
You know, there were always different viewpoints. This committee, though important, was part of a broader framework. The cabinet mission scheme influenced a lot of their decisions.
Very interesting. Could you tell us more about the cabinet mission scheme?
The British government's plan for the transfer of power.
So, this committee was working within certain guidelines.
Absolutely. It was a crucial step in the process.
How did the drafting of the Objectives Resolution itself affect the final outcome? This must have been a crucial discussion.
Well, it reflected the goals of the nation in a very concise way. It defined some of the core values, you know, which shaped the entire constitutional process.
Fascinating. Was the committee's work fully accepted, or were there changes and disagreements?
Of course, you know, discussions went on, and there were refinements. It was a long process.
So, this committee wasn't just a suggestion box. It actually had a significant impact.
A huge impact. A lot of things that we see in the final document were influenced by this committee.
Remarkable. Okay, so we've seen the groundwork laid by the experts committee. Now, let's look at the Constituent Assembly itself. What were some of the critiques leveled at its processes?
Well, there were plenty of criticisms. Some argued the assembly wasn't truly representative.
Not truly representative? How so?
Critics pointed out that its members weren't directly elected by all Indians, no universal adult franchise.
A significant point. What else?
Some also argued it wasn't truly sovereign, influenced by the British proposals.
So, dependent on Britain?
It held sessions with British permission. There were strings attached.
Interesting. Any other complaints?
Oh, absolutely. The time taken was a major point of contention. Critics argued it took too long, too drawn out.
Too long? Like, how long is too long?
Compared to, say, the American Constitution, which was drafted in 4 months, it seemed excessive. Naziruddin Ahmed, a member, even nicknamed the drafting committee the Drifting Committee.
Drifting Committee. Ouch! What else?
The Assembly was also accused of being heavily Congress-dominated. Austin's quote sums it up. The Constituent Assembly was a one-party body in an essentially one-party country.
Wow, a strong statement. Were there other biases?
Yes, many felt the assembly was dominated by lawyers and politicians, meaning other sections of society weren't represented enough. This is often blamed for the document's complexity.
So a lack of diversity, in some ways.
Also, some critics argued it was Hindu-dominated.
That's a very sensitive issue. So what do you think about these critiques?
Well, it's important to acknowledge the legitimacy of the criticisms. However, the assembly was a fledgling democratic body. A new nation needed time.
So, there's a balance?
Absolutely. There were valid concerns, but the assembly was operating in a complex and often unprecedented situation.
Fair enough. But what impact did these critiques have, ultimately?
It highlights the inherent challenges of forming a new nation. It forces us to consider the compromises made in the pursuit of unity.
Okay, Lakshmikant, we've looked at the criticisms. Now let's shift gears. Tell us about the people behind the scenes, the individuals who crafted the Constitution.
Absolutely. The Constituent Assembly had a team of experts.
Like who?
Sir B.N. Rao was the constitutional advisor. Crucial, you know.
Crucial how? Why?
He provided legal guidance. A foundation for the document.
And the secretary?
Eaeenrrk was the secretary, ensuring everything ran smoothly.
Smoothly. So, the draftsmen, the actual writers?
S.N. Mukherjee was the chief draftsman, a key figure.
And beyond the words, the calligraphy.
Prembihari Narain Rezada, the calligrapher, hand-wrote the original in a beautiful italic style.
Wow. And the artists?
Artists from Shantiniketan, including Nand Lal Bose and Bihar Ramanohar Sinha, beautified it.
What was their role?
They illuminated and decorated pages, made it visually appealing. Added layers of artistry.
So, symbolism?
Absolutely. This reflected India's artistic traditions. It was more than just aesthetics.
Did they use any particular style?
Well, Bihar Ramanohar Sinha worked on the preamble. His artwork elevated the document.
And the Hindi version?
Vasant Krishan Vaidya wrote the Hindi calligraphy, Nand Lal Bose elegantly decorated it.
So, it's a combination of legal, political, and artistic expertise. Intriguing.
Yes, a comprehensive approach. It's a testament to the collective effort.
So, beyond the criticisms, these details illuminate the dedication of many individuals.
Exactly. These are the human stories behind a monumental document.
Makes you appreciate the document even more, don't you think?
Definitely. The artistic elements add depth. The detail is remarkable.
Absolutely. So, this dedication shines through in the final document. Makes for a compelling story.
It really does.
Lakshmikant, we've just seen the dedication of the people who drafted the Constitution. But how did the Constitution evolve to include a Hindi translation?
Well, originally, it didn't have provision for a Hindi text.
So, when did that change?
The 1987 Constitutional Amendment Act introduced Article 394A.
Article 394A? What does that do?
It established an authoritative Hindi text. It mandates the President publishing a Hindi translation.
Mandates? Meaning legally required. Why was this needed?
Well, you know, the Constitution was originally in English. Over time, the need for accessibility in Hindi grew.
A need that wasn't there before?
Absolutely. The amendment created the authoritative Hindi text. It makes it equally binding.
So, all the legal interpretations now rely on both texts?
Yes. If there's a conflict, the President would have to resolve it, revise the Hindi text.
So, there's a safety net if there are problems in translation?
Exactly.
What are some implications of having two official versions?
Well, it makes the Constitution accessible to a wider population. Also, it can also lead to some interesting legal discussions.
So, you're saying that there might be different interpretations of a clause depending on which language you use?
Potentially, yes. But the amendment ensures a similar meaning. Any difference is clarified by the President.
So it ensures consistency, but acknowledges the possibility of interpretation difference. Intriguing.
Yes, very important. It's a testament to India's multilingual nature and the efforts to make the document accessible.
A very significant step, then. This amendment shows the Constitution is a living document.
Absolutely, that's the beauty of it. It adapts to the needs of the time.
A great point. So, it's more than just translation, it's about inclusivity.
Definitely, and ensuring all citizens can understand the laws of the land.
Makes you appreciate the evolution of the document.
It really does.
Thank you, Lakshmikant. Lakshmikant, fascinating. So, we've seen how the Constitution was adapted to include Hindi. Now let's talk about its fundamental character. How does it differ from other constitutions in your view?
Well, it's very unique. While borrowed from many others, India's constitution is quite distinct, especially in its adaptability and spirit. It's undergone significant changes.
Can you give us an example of those changes?
Certainly. The 42nd Amendment, for instance, was quite transformative. It introduced numerous changes across several parts of the document. That's why it's often called the mini-constitution.
Wow, a mini-constitution. What about its impact?
Well, the amendments reflected the evolving needs of the nation. But, it triggered a crucial Supreme Court ruling.
Oh, the Amenasbility case? What about it?
In 1973, the Supreme Court established the basic structure doctrine. It essentially limits what Parliament can change.
Limits what Parliament can change? How so?
You see, while Parliament can amend the Constitution, it cannot alter its fundamental framework, its basic structure.
So, what's considered basic structure?
That's a complex issue, still debated today. Things like the rule of law, the separation of powers.
So, fundamental principles are sort of enshrined, unchangeable?
Exactly. It's a balancing act. The Constitution can adapt to new realities, but it protects core principles.
This basic structure doctrine is unique to India?
It is a significant difference, compared to other countries' approaches.
So, essentially, the Constitution can evolve, but it can't be fundamentally rewritten?
Correct. The amendments reflect India's social and political context. But they must respect the Constitution's fundamental principles.
Intriguing. So, the Constitution is a dynamic, evolving document.
Yes, a living document, adapting to the changing needs of India's society.
Fascinating. Thanks, Lakshmikant.
You're welcome.
Listeners, we'll continue this exploration of the Indian Constitution next time. Lakshmikant, fantastic. So, this Constitution, this massive document, how does it stack up against others?
Well, it's the longest written constitution in the world, a very comprehensive and detailed document.
Wow, that's massive. Why so lengthy?
Geographical and historical factors play a role. India's size and diversity, along with the influence of the bulky 1935 Act, contributed significantly.
Borrowing from other constitutions, right?
Indeed. The Constitution borrowed extensively. Think of it as a combination of ideas.
So, it's a bit of a mashup?
Laughs, a careful mashup, yes. Essential principles from the US, Ireland, the British model, and others.
And is it rigid or flexible?
A blend of both. Some parts require special amendment procedures, others are easier.
So, different levels of changeability?
Exactly. This careful balance is crucial.
So, the fundamental rights and things, how do they fare?
They're very important, but not absolute. They can be restricted.
So limitations exist. That's tricky.
Yes, balancing individual freedoms with societal needs.
What about secularism in India's context?
A positive concept, offering equal respect to all religions.
And what about federalism?
Federal in form, but unitary in spirit. A unique structure.
Independent bodies too. Explain that.
Yes, Election Commission, CAG, the UPSC. Crucial for checks and balances.
Emergency provisions, are they necessary?
Designed to address extraordinary situations. A balancing act.
Single citizenship, is that unique?
Yes, different from other federal systems where citizens might have dual allegiances.
Fascinating. So, the Constitution is both an architect and a document.
It adapts, yet safeguards core principles. A dynamic document.
Lakshmikant, this chunk dives into the criticisms of India's constitution. Interesting stuff. So, from our last discussion, we've looked at what the Constitution is doing. Now, what are some of the main arguments people have had about how it was designed?
Well, some critics argued it was fundamentally a borrowed constitution, hodgepodge, not truly reflecting Indian values.
A bag of borrowings? Intriguing. How did the framers address this?
Dr. Ambedkar, for instance, argued that all constitutions have aspects borrowed from others. They tweaked and adapted them for Indian conditions, avoiding the faults.
So, a remix, not a carbon copy?
Exactly. Crucial to adapt. Think of it as a musical composition. You borrow melodies and harmonies, but you create a new piece.
Okay, but weren't some of those borrowings pretty substantial? Like the 1935 Act?
Yes, many provisions came from the 1935 Act. Critics called it a carbon copy.
And Dr. Ambedkar's response?
He argued there's nothing wrong with borrowing fundamentals, you know. He acknowledged the substantial borrowings but highlighted that these were mostly administrative details, adapted for India's needs.
So, it's not just a literal copy, but a reimagining?
Exactly. Critics also said it was un-Indian, un-Gandhian.
What were the concerns there?
Some felt it didn't reflect India's political traditions or Gandhi's vision of village-level governance.
How did the framers respond?
The framers pointed out adaptations and compromises made for the unique context of the country.
An elephantine size?
Yes, some critics thought it was unnecessarily long and complicated. They called it a lawyer's paradise.
Interesting. So, it's not just about the content, but also the style and the impact it has on the way we interact with the law.
Absolutely. It's about balance and fit for purpose. The Constitution was born amidst considerable debate.
So, in essence, the Constitution was a product of its time, designed amidst various constraints and criticisms.
Absolutely. A compromise for a complex society.
Lakshmikant, we've looked at the criticisms of the Constitution's design. Now, let's zoom in on its heart. What's the preamble, and why is it important?
The preamble, you know, is like the introduction, the preface. It sums up the whole Constitution.
So, the core ideas?
Exactly. It's the Constitution's identity card.
Sounds important. How did it come about?
It's based on Nehru's Objectives Resolution, adopted by the Constituent Assembly.
So, this isn't just some afterthought?
No, it's central. It lays out the founding principles.
And what about those amendments?
The 42nd Amendment added socialist, secular, and integrity.
So, there was a reimagining of goals?
Precisely. A shift in focus.
How does this work in practice? Do courts rely on it?
Sometimes. It guides the interpretation of the rest of the Constitution.
So, is it legally binding?
Well, it's not a law itself but its philosophical foundation.
Interesting. What about the original values it enshrined?
Initially, it aimed at creating a just and equitable society.
So, it's a living document, adapting to societal needs?
Yes, reflecting the changing times.
Does it influence how we think about justice and equity today?
Undoubtedly. It shapes our values.
Like, say, the debates about social justice?
Definitely. It influences arguments about social welfare and equality.
So, it's not just about words, but about ideals we strive for?
Exactly. The Preamble shows the heart of the Indian Constitution.
That's really valuable.
Yes. It's why the Preamble is so fundamental.
Lakshmikant, wow, this is the actual Preamble. It's powerful, isn't it?
Yes, it's the heart of the Constitution. It lays out the aspirations of the nation.
Sovereign Socialist Secular Democratic Republic. That's a mouthful.
Well, it captures the fundamental aspirations of India.
Justice, social, economic, and political. What does that even mean in practice?
It means a just society with equal opportunities for all. It's about fairness and equality in all aspects of life.
Liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, worship. Wow, that's a wide range.
Absolutely. It highlights freedom and respect for diverse views.
And equality? Can you elaborate?
Equality of status and opportunity. Everyone should have the same rights.
So, fraternity, the last value, is critical.
It's about creating a sense of unity. A bond where individuals are treated with dignity and the nation is strong.
It's really beautiful, these values. How has this vision influenced India over time?
It has certainly been a guiding force for legislation and policy.
A question then, how have these values been interpreted through time, especially the socialist aspect?
Well, that's interesting. The original intent was different, it's evolved. There's been debate over its implementation over the decades.
The Preamble, is it enforceable in court?
No, it's more of a guiding principle. It helps interpret other constitutional provisions. The text itself is not a legally enforceable instrument.
So, is this the end of the conversation then?
Not quite. It lays the foundation for future debate on how these aspirations translate into policies.
Interesting. What specific laws or policies have been formed with this as their backing?
Many laws relating to social welfare stem from these principles. For example.
Excellent. We've just scratched the surface here. Lakshmikant, so the Preamble is structured, it seems. This new information really helps us understand it better.
Exactly, it's not just a flowery statement, it's a blueprint.
For parts, you say. Can you tell us more?
Sure. First, the source of authority, the people. It's a critical idea.
Right. The people give the Constitution its legitimacy.
Absolutely. The second part is the nature of the state. Sovereign, socialist, secular.
Sovereignty, that's crucial. What does that mean?
Independent of external control. India has its own internal affairs decisions.
And socialist? That's a word that generates debate.
Yes, it was initially about state intervention in the economy. But its meaning has evolved.
Interesting. What about objectives?
Justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity, the goals the nation is trying to achieve.
And the fourth part? The date.
It marks the historical moment of adoption.
So, the Preamble isn't something you can take to court?
Correct. It's a guiding principle, not legally enforceable.
How does it influence legal cases then?
It helps interpret other parts of the Constitution. It acts as a lens.
Can you think of an example?
Imagine a case about social justice. The Preamble's principles about equality would definitely factor in.
Wow, that clarifies things. So, the Preamble is the Constitution's foundation, providing direction.
Exactly. A blueprint for the nation's aspirations.
Thanks, Lakshmikant.
You're welcome.
Lakshmikant, so these words, sovereign socialist, they're not just empty words, right? They have specific meanings.
Absolutely. Sovereign means India is independent. Free to make its own choices.
So, even with ties to the Commonwealth.
Exactly. Those ties don't impinge on India's sovereignty.
Okay, socialist. What's the deal there? It seems a bit fuzzy.
Well, it was about the state playing a role in the economy. Not communism. A mixed economy.
So, not total government control?
No, a blend of public and private sectors.
Interesting. And secular?
The state doesn't favor any religion. All religions equal. Added in 1976 by amendment.
So, the preamble is a living document then?
Its meaning can evolve, especially with Supreme Court interpretations.
Justice, liberty. What's the link?
They're interconnected. Liberty without equality isn't true liberty.
Equality before the law is important, but can it be applied to economic situations?
Yes, economic justice is part of it.
What about fraternity? A sense of brotherhood?
Yeah, unity and integrity of the nation. Protecting individual dignity.
So, these ideas like social justice, economic justice, they're key parts of the preamble?
Very much so, aimed at ensuring a society that values equality and the dignity of all.
How does the Supreme Court factor into all this?
They interpret the Constitution, and the preamble's values are often part of those interpretations.
So, the preamble's words have been debated over time?
Absolutely. The meaning of socialist, for example, has changed.
Could you give an example of how the preamble influences a court case?
A case about equal opportunity. The preamble's ideas about equality are important context.
So, you're saying the preamble isn't just a statement, but a guide?
It's a compass pointing toward the ideals the Constitution seeks to achieve.
Fascinating.
Thanks. We've only scratched the surface.
So, Lakshmikant, you mentioned the preamble is the heart of the Constitution. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. It's the guiding principle, the blueprint. Think of it as the overall vision, the philosophy behind everything.
So, like a roadmap for the Constitution?
Exactly. It outlines the core values, principles, and aspirations that the entire document strives to achieve.
These key figures from the Constituent Assembly, what did they mean when they called it the horoscope?
They saw it as the destiny, the foretelling of India's future as a nation.
Interesting. So, it's not just words on paper, but a living guide?
Precisely. It's meant to be interpreted and reinterpreted in the context of changing times.
How does this living element compare to the Declaration of Independence?
While both are foundational, the preamble is within a functioning legal system. It's more than a declaration, it's a core component of a system of laws and rights.
Okay, so, what's the role of the courts in all this?
Courts use the preamble as a tool, as a reference point when interpreting legal provisions. It helps define the scope of certain laws and rights.
Can you give an example of this?
You know, a case about equality or economic justice. The preamble could be central to shaping the court's decision.
So, the preamble guides interpretations, influences court decisions, and defines India's aspirations?
Exactly. It's not just a history lesson, it's a living, breathing part of the constitutional machinery.
That's really insightful. So, how does someone new to Indian constitutionalism get a handle on this?
Study the preamble first. It's the key to unlocking the whole document.
Fascinating. Thanks, Lakshmikant.
You're welcome. We've only touched the surface.
Lakshmikant, the preamble's role is fascinating. But what about its legal status?
You know, it's been a bit of a legal tug-of-war.
Really?
Yeah. Early cases, like Barabari, said it wasn't part of the Constitution.
So, it wasn't legally binding?
Exactly. But, later cases, like Kesavananda, changed that.
So, it's now recognized?
Yes, the Supreme Court has increasingly recognized it as part of the Constitution, influencing how laws are interpreted.
But it's not justiciable, right?
Precisely, you can't sue over it.
Interesting. Why not?
Because it doesn't create legal rights or obligations, just guiding principles.
So, how does that affect its power?
It shapes how courts interpret the Constitution's provisions but doesn't provide grounds for direct legal action.
So, kind of like a philosophical compass.
Exactly. It sets the direction, but the specific tools to reach those destinations are in other parts of the Constitution.
So the Kesavananda ruling is significant.
Yeah, a key shift in interpretation, and that LIC ruling too.
Wow, quite a journey for its legal recognition.
You bet. It's constantly evolving.
This historical evolution of the court's position is fascinating.
It shows how the Constitution isn't a static document but dynamic.
A really interesting development. Can you think of an example where it influenced a court decision?
Of course. Think of cases involving fundamental rights, where the preamble's emphasis on equality might be a crucial consideration.
So the preamble helps with the meaning of provisions, but not its direct enforcement.
Exactly. A powerful tool of interpretation.
Thanks for the clarification, M. Lakshmikant.
You're welcome, Vansh.
So, M. Lakshmikant, if the preamble isn't directly enforceable, can it be changed?
Yes, but with caveats.
What are those?
The Kesavananda case, introduced this basic features concept.
Interesting. Can you explain?
Basically, amendments can't alter the fundamental structure or principles of the Constitution, embedded in the preamble.
So, it's a limitation on the amending power?
Exactly. Article 368, while granting the power to amend, is restricted by this basic features doctrine.
So, what exactly falls under basic features? A bit ambiguous.
That's the rub. It's open to interpretation by the Supreme Court.
So what about the 42nd Amendment? That added words.
That's a good example. The Supreme Court found it valid. They felt the additions didn't compromise basic features.
So, does that change the interpretation?
Not radically, but it does provide a precedent.
What about other amendments? Does this doctrine limit them?
Certainly, every amendment is scrutinized against this basic features test.
Wow, that's quite a check on power.
It's the court's way of ensuring the Constitution remains adaptable but not fundamentally altered.
So the Supreme Court, in a sense, is upholding the original intent of the framers?
You could say that, but it's also adapting the intent to modern challenges.
Fascinating. M. Lakshmikant, does this doctrine affect citizens' rights?
Absolutely. The way the Constitution evolves, how its basic tenets remain intact, has a profound impact on the rights and freedoms citizens enjoy.
This is quite insightful. So, basically, the preamble is not just a philosophical statement. It's a fundamental guiding force for the country?
Absolutely.
Makes sense, thanks M. Lakshmikant. So M. Lakshmikant, we've been exploring the preamble, its amendment, and its implications. Now let's zoom out a bit. How does the actual structure of the Indian Union, as laid out in the Constitution, relate to all this?
Excellent question. Part 1, outlining the Union and its territory, is foundational.
So, what exactly does that mean?
It defines India as a union of states. It specifies the territory.
So what's the practical meaning?
It sets the stage for everything else. It's the bedrock.
Okay, but what about territorial disputes? How does this handle them?
Well, the Constitution provides a framework for dealing with changes to the territory over time.
Can you give an example?
Changes to state boundaries, for example, need constitutional amendment.
So, how does this relate to our earlier discussion about amending the Constitution?
Absolutely. Changes to the Union structure and territory are subject to the amendment process, with the court potentially reviewing for basic features.
Is there a specific article relevant to this?
Article 1 and 2 are quite relevant.
Got it. And how does this impact the average citizen?
It shapes the country's structure, affects how the government functions, and directly impacts the citizens' rights and responsibilities.
So, the territory defines the political landscape and impacts citizens' lives significantly.
Absolutely, the structure of the Union sets the ground rules.
That's fascinating. What do you think are the core aspects of a country's foundational structure?
Core elements include the relationship between the central and state governments, the powers given to each, and how the Constitution ensures that the Union remains intact.
That's very helpful. Lakshmikant. Now, how does the union structure interact with issues like state autonomy or the protection of minorities?
The Constitution balances these elements carefully.
So, essentially, the structure of the union is more than just lines on a map?
Absolutely. It's about the power dynamics and the framework of governance.
Excellent. So, Lakshmikant, we've been looking at the Constitution structure, and now specifically Article 1. What's the significance of calling India a union of states rather than a federation?
Well, it's a subtle but crucial difference. Union implies a more integrated whole.
So, what's the practical difference between a union and a federation?
A federation often implies a stronger agreement among independent states, while a union emphasizes the indivisibility of the nation.
Interesting. So, what was the reasoning behind this in the Constituent Assembly?
The framers emphasized India's unique history. States didn't join as equals, it was a unified entity.
Okay. So, what about territories? How are they categorized, and who manages them?
Well, we have states, union territories, and territories acquired. States have a degree of autonomy.
And union territories?
Union territories are directly administered by the central government.
Can you give us a real-world example of a territory being acquired?
Sure, Goa and Daman and Diu.
That's fascinating. So, Article 2 and 3, about admitting or establishing new states, how do those play into this?
They empower Parliament to add or create new states.
That's a huge power, isn't it? What about the impact on existing states?
Article 3 deals with internal adjustments to existing states.
So, basically, the Constitution outlines how the whole thing works and how territories fit within this whole.
Yes, it's about maintaining the integrity of the Union.
How does this practically affect the average citizen?
It sets the framework for the country's political structure, impacting things like the distribution of power, resource allocation, and citizens' rights.
That's an interesting perspective. Thanks, Lakshmikant.
You're welcome.
Now, what about the special provisions for certain states?
There are special provisions in Part 21 for states like Maharashtra and Gujarat.
So, those states have extra protections?
Yes, or different rules applicable to specific areas within a state.
Makes a lot of sense. This is quite intricate.
It is. But understanding these intricacies is essential.
So, Lakshmikant, we've explored the idea of India as a union, and now we're looking at Article 3. What's the deal with Parliament's power to reshape states?
Well, Article 3 gives Parliament significant power to form, alter, or even eliminate states.
Wow. So, no state consent needed?
That's right. It's a huge power. It can create, change, or even diminish a state's size.
So, they can just redraw the political map as they see fit?
Pretty much. But there are some safeguards and considerations.
President's involvement?
The president has to be involved, and they need the input from the state legislatures.
Wait, so states have a say?
They get a chance to give their views, but Parliament's not obliged to follow them.
That's interesting. So, indestructible union of destructible states. What does that mean?
It means the union itself is strong, but individual states' borders and structures aren't guaranteed.
So, the union is more important?
It's about balancing the need for national unity with flexibility for change.
So, what about the Barabari Union case?
That's a key example. Parliament's power to reduce state size doesn't include the cession of territory to a foreign country.
They need a constitutional amendment?
Exactly. So, the Supreme Court has limitations on Parliament's power to shift territory in that way.
What's the difference between a boundary dispute and a cession?
A boundary dispute can be settled by executive action, while a cession requires an amendment. There's a big difference.
So, this really balances national interest and individual state needs in a dynamic way.
Absolutely. It's a constant negotiation between power centers.
How does that affect citizens?
It affects how power is shared and resources are allocated, impacting the lives of citizens in the affected regions.
Wow, this is complex.
It is. But understanding these rules is vital.
It's all about balance, really, isn't it?
That's the core of it.
Thanks for clarifying.
You're welcome.
So Lakshmikant, we've been talking about Parliament's powers to reshape states, and now we're looking at a real-world example, the India-Bangladesh border changes.
Exactly. The 100th Amendment was all about adjusting territories.
This is fascinating. Can you tell us more about what kind of adjustments?
A significant exchange of enclaves and adverse possessions.
What exactly are enclaves?
Enclaves are bits of territory completely surrounded by another country's territory.
An adverse possession?
Land that's been held or used by one party for so long it can become legally their own.
So, the 100th Amendment involves swapping these, requiring constitutional action, huh?
Yes, it involved amending the first schedule which details territory.
Why was a constitutional amendment needed instead of a simple agreement?
You see, altering borders often involves altering the Constitution. It's more than just a treaty.
So, was there some historical context?
Absolutely, there were previous agreements and even Supreme Court rulings that played a role.
So, the 100th Amendment was the final solution?
It brought a decades-long effort to a close, resolving the lingering border issues.
What was the impact on the 4 affected states?
The amendment impacted the territories of Assam, West Bengal, Meghalaya, and Tripura, requiring changes to the first schedule.
So, this illustrates the balance between national interest and the needs of specific states?
Precisely. It highlights the intricate nature of the process.
So, it was a necessary amendment given the history and the issues involved.
Yes, it was a culmination of historical circumstances and negotiations.
And this is something we can see in other examples?
Certainly, constitutional amendments can be crucial tools in the management of international relations.
Interesting insights.
Thank you.
Thanks for the information.
You're welcome.
Lakshmikant, we were just discussing Parliament's power to adjust boundaries, and now we're diving into the fascinating history of integrating princely states. Tell us, how did that process begin?
Well, India at independence had a unique structure, with British provinces and princely states. The Independence Act gave these states choices.
So, tell us about those choices.
They could join India, Pakistan, or remain independent. Amazingly, most chose India.
But there were some holdouts.
Yes, Hyderabad, Junagadh, and Kashmir initially resisted. It took a few different approaches to bring them in.
What approaches?
A police action for Hyderabad, a referendum for Junagadh, and the instrument of accession for Kashmir. It was a complex dance of political maneuvering.
And after that initial integration, how did states continue to change?
The 1950s saw the creation of different categories of states. Part A, B, C, and D.
Could you elaborate on these parts?
Part A were former British provinces, Part B princely states with legislatures, Part C were chief commissioners' provinces, and Part D were territories.
So, it wasn't just a simple matter of existing boundaries.
Exactly. There were commissions like the Aadhaar Commission and the JVP Committee, initially advocating for administrative convenience instead of language-based divisions.
This sounds like a pretty volatile period.
You're right. The Andhra state creation, spurred by popular agitation and a hunger strike, finally forced the hand of the government to create the first linguistic state.
That's a powerful example of how political pressure can impact policy. Were there other factors in the process?
Absolutely. The Fazl Ali Commission later recognized language as a significant factor but emphasized preserving national unity.
Fascinating. So, the act of adjusting state boundaries was a multifaceted challenge?
You bet. It highlighted the need to carefully balance national unity with regional and linguistic identities.
Wow, this is complex. So much political maneuvering.
It absolutely was. And the reorganizations continued well into the 20th century, with new states emerging.
Lakshmikant, we've been exploring the shifting map of India. Now let's zoom in on the people who inhabit that land. What does Indian law say about citizens and those who aren't?
Well, like any state, India distinguishes between citizens and aliens.
Can you elaborate?
Citizens are full members, owe allegiance, and get full civil and political rights.
And aliens?
Aliens are not citizens, from another state, with different rights.
How are aliens categorized?
Friendly or enemy. Friendly aliens, from countries with good ties, get more rights.
Enemy aliens?
Less, like not being protected from arrest, under Article 22.
So, different levels of rights, depending on the country the alien comes from?
Exactly.
What key rights do Indian citizens enjoy?
Article 15, no discrimination. Article 16, equal opportunity, freedoms in Article 19.
Like what freedoms?
Speech, assembly, association, movement, profession.
It sounds comprehensive.
Plus cultural rights, voting, running for office, and holding certain key positions.
Like what?
President, judges, governors.
Interesting. And what duties do citizens have?
Pay taxes, respect the flag and anthem, defend the nation.
A reciprocal relationship. So, comparing this to the U.S., is there a difference?
Yes. Naturalized citizens aren't eligible for the U.S. presidency, a key difference.
That's a crucial distinction.
Yeah, shows different priorities in citizenship.
So, you're saying Indian citizenship laws are quite nuanced.
Definitely. There's historical context, evolving international relations, and the need for a balance of rights and duties.
So, the evolution is complex.
Complex, dynamic, and constantly evolving.
Interesting. Thanks for that insight.
You're welcome.
Lakshmikant, you've painted a picture of citizen rights, but how does the Constitution actually define who's a citizen?
Well, the Constitution itself lays it out, Part 2, Articles 5 to 11.
But it doesn't have all the answers, right?
Precisely. It establishes basic principles but delegates the specifics to Parliament.
So, what happened on January 26, 1950?
That's when the initial criteria were set. Certain people were automatically citizens.
Can you describe those categories?
Sure. People domiciled in India, with one of these criteria, born here, parent born here, or resident for 5 years.
Interesting. And people migrating from Pakistan?
Yeah, those who moved before 1948 had different conditions.
Like what?
Ordinary residents since their arrival. After 1948, registration within 6 months of residency.
So, it's a layered process?
Exactly. And there were provisions for those who migrated from India to Pakistan and later returned.
Wow, a complex patchwork.
Yes. Also, people of Indian origin overseas could register.
That's a vital provision for the diaspora.
Absolutely.
So, the Constitution lays the foundation, but Parliament fleshes it out.
Absolutely. With the Citizenship Act of 1955.
And what about someone who becomes a citizen of another country?
Then they lose Indian citizenship, a crucial rule.
A critical restriction. What if someone becomes a citizen of another country and then returns?
Well, there might be ways to regain Indian citizenship, the specifics of which are detailed in current laws.
Makes sense. And Parliament can amend those laws too?
Yes. To reflect changing times and circumstances.
Makes it a dynamic system.
It has to be. India's a nation of immigrants and those who came, those who stayed.
Intriguing. So, it's a moving target.
Yes, a constantly adapting legal framework.
Lakshmikant, you mentioned the Citizenship Act of 1955. Can you give us a quick rundown of how it works?
Sure. It lays out 5 major ways to become an Indian citizen.
Fascinating. Can you elaborate on the different routes?
There's birth, descent, registration, naturalization, and incorporating new territories.
Birth, how does that work?
It's different based on birth dates. Prior to certain dates, it was automatic. Now, it depends on the parent's citizenship.
So, it's changed over time?
Yes. The rules have evolved as India's situation has changed.
So, how does descent work? Can you give an example?
A person born outside India with a citizen parent might be eligible.
But with certain conditions.
Absolutely. Birth certificates, registration deadlines, and a renunciation clause are important.
Interesting. So, registration. How does that work?
Well, there are various categories. People of Indian origin, those married to Indians, or overseas Indians with proper residency.
Sounds complex.
It is. Each category has unique requirements, like minimum residency periods.
Naturalization. What are the requirements?
Extensive. Good character, specific language skills, and residency periods are required.
Can we imagine a real-life example? What about someone from Pakistan, who migrated earlier?
There would be specific criteria depending on when they migrated.
So, the historical context matters?
Very much so. Different laws applied at different times.
What about the Assam Accord?
There are special provisions in place for people from Bangladesh who moved to Assam before a particular date.
Wow, this gets pretty complicated.
It does. The Citizenship Act tries to navigate various historical and social realities.
Makes sense. So, it's not a static law. It's evolving.
Indeed. A living document adapting to India's changing circumstances.
So the laws are complex, but necessary?
Precisely. To manage the vast population and their migration patterns.
Lakshmikant, we've been looking at how to become an Indian citizen. Now let's talk about the opposite. How can you lose it?
There are 3 main ways: renunciation, termination, and deprivation.
Renunciation, you just give it up?
Precisely. A conscious, formal declaration.
But are there any catches?
Well, during a war, the government can hold off on registering it.
So, you can't just give up your citizenship whenever you want?
It's more complicated than that. There are circumstances that impact the process.
Termination, that's losing it automatically, right?
Correct. If you voluntarily take on another country's citizenship.
But what about if it's involuntary? Like a political refugee?
The Act specifically says voluntary. It's important to understand that context.
What's deprivation? The government taking it away?
Yes. In certain serious cases, like fraud or disloyalty.
Like fraud in getting citizenship? Interesting.
Or if you are found to be disloyal, or had unlawfully communicated with an enemy.
What about time limits on these processes?
Yes. There are time limits on certain issues. Such as imprisonment within a certain time frame after gaining citizenship.
And if you were imprisoned for something you didn't do?
Well, that's a serious claim. The burden of proof is on the claimant. There would be a process to address it.
That makes sense.
There are clearly defined processes and regulations.
This seems quite thorough.
It's complex, but important to manage the citizenship.
A lot of nuance to losing citizenship.
Absolutely. It highlights the delicate balance between individual rights and national security.
Thanks for clarifying this.
My pleasure.
Lakshmikant, following up on citizenship loss, let's talk about the structure of citizenship in India. It's unique, right?
Yes, India has a single citizenship system. Unlike the US, where you're a citizen of both the nation and the state.
So, everyone's treated equally regardless of where they live?
Generally, yes. But there are exceptions.
Like what?
Well, Parliament can set residency requirements for certain jobs in a state. Think local government positions.
Wow, that's nuanced.
Exactly. There are specific instances where the government can make exceptions, like certain employment laws in some states.
So, are these exceptions discriminatory?
The Constitution has provisions to avoid that. It prevents discrimination based on religion, race, and place of birth.
But residency requirements, aren't those based on residence?
It's a very specific case with a history. It's nuanced.
What about scheduled tribes? Doesn't their right to reside in their territory need exceptions?
The Constitution protects their interests. Restrictions on outsiders' movement, residents are there to safeguard their culture.
Wow, Jammu and Kashmir had a special status. What happened there?
It had unique provisions, like Article 35A, allowing special rights to permanent residents. But this was removed in 2019.
So, are we closer to a truly unified nation with a single citizenship system?
It's a complex issue. While the Constitution aims for a unified nation, various social tensions remain.
Right, I see. It's still a work in progress, you'd say.
Precisely. Single citizenship is a core principle, but the Constitution allows for exceptions in specific cases.
A fascinating case study.
Indeed.
So, does this help understand the framework for the citizens of India?
Definitely. It's a very important aspect of Indian polity, especially from the citizen's perspective.
Thanks for breaking this down.
My pleasure.
Lakshmikant, shifting gears a bit. Let's talk about Overseas Citizenship of India, OCI. It's a bit different from general Indian citizenship, right?
Absolutely. It's a special scheme for people of Indian origin living abroad.
So, what exactly is it?
It's not dual citizenship. India's constitution doesn't allow dual citizenship.
So it's something else?
Think of it as a special status allowing ease of travel and access. A special privilege, essentially.
Interesting. Why was it created?
Well, to connect with the Indian diaspora globally. Over time, there have been several iterations.
Like how?
It started with the PIO scheme, then OCI, and eventually, they were merged.
What were the key differences in these schemes?
The schemes had varying provisions. The key was to simplify and unify.
So, tell me about these amendments in greater detail.
In 2015, the PIO and OCI schemes merged, creating one streamlined system. It was about simplification and convenience.
What's the significance of Article 9, given all this?
Crucial. The Constitution prohibits dual citizenship, but OCI falls into a special, separate category.
Any countries that were excluded?
Pakistan and Bangladesh. Complex political and historical factors.
So, why specifically those countries?
That's a complicated, complex history.
It's important to understand that there isn't a simple answer.
Exactly. It's a nuanced issue with various considerations.
So, is this OCI scheme truly successful in its goals?
That's a question that could be debated. Long-term effects are still unfolding.
It's a very important question. Thanks for that. Really insightful.
You're welcome. Glad to help.
Lakshmikant, so now we're diving deep into the OCI application process. What are the basic requirements?
Exactly. This chunk spells out who's eligible. It's not just anyone.
So, tell me about some specific criteria.
Citizens of other countries who were Indian citizens, or were eligible to be, at a certain point.
Wow, that's a bit nuanced. So, how about the families of these individuals?
Yes, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, also qualify.
Interesting. Are there any exceptions or exclusions?
Definitely. People with familial ties to Pakistan or Bangladesh, or those specified by the government, aren't eligible.
Wow, that's significant. Why these exclusions, do you know?
Historically complicated. It's political and historical factors, not just legal.
So, is there any flexibility in the system?
Yes. The government can consider special circumstances, if needed.
That seems fair in certain cases.
The government has significant flexibility under their powers.
This makes it slightly less rigid, but still complex.
Absolutely. It's a balance of principles and flexibility in a complex context.
Let's explore a scenario. What if someone's grandparent was from Pakistan?
They would likely be ineligible.
So, is there a clear and easy way for applicants to understand if they qualify?
Not necessarily. There's no universal yes or no.
Lakshmikant, that's a good point.
It's better to consult a legal expert.
Lakshmikant, thanks for laying out this critical information.
You're welcome. Glad to clarify.
Lakshmikant, fascinating. Now we're getting into the actual rights of an OCI. What specific rights are not granted to them?
Well, they can't vote in Indian elections.
Interesting, but are there any other notable restrictions?
Yes. No public employment equality, key positions like president and judge are off limits.
Wow, that's a significant set of limitations. Is this to be expected from a non-citizen?
Well, it's a deliberate choice. It reflects the government's stance on citizenship. It's delicate balance, you know.
So, why these particular exclusions? A judge, for example?
It's about maintaining the integrity of the position, the system, a natural restriction.
So the OCI can't even run for office?
Exactly, no House of the People, or Council of States, or state assemblies.
So, what about specific public service roles? Any flexibility?
Yes, the government can specify certain jobs. But it's at their discretion.
So, this clause about specific roles gives flexibility to the government?
Absolutely. It allows some wiggle room in the system.
But isn't that potentially problematic? Lakshmikant? Favoritism or bias creeping in?
Potentially, yes. But the aim is to create a balance.
A good point, Lakshmikant. Let's imagine an OCI who's a highly qualified doctor. Could they become a government doctor in India?
Possibly, but only if that specific role is deemed suitable by the government.
So, it's conditional?
It's not automatic. It's conditional on government approval.
That's a critical nuance.
It's a balancing act, you see.
Lakshmikant, thanks for providing this crucial information. Very helpful to understand these limitations.
My pleasure.
Interesting conversation.
Thanks, Vansh. We've covered some really important points here.
Lakshmikant, we've explored the restrictions on OCI rights. Now, what about the opposite? How does someone actually give up OCI status?
Well, there's a formal renunciation process.
So, it's not just a matter of stopping using the card?
No, a specific declaration is required.
And what happens to the family?
It's interesting. The spouse and minor children also lose their OCI status.
Wow, that's a significant consequence. Is there a reason for that?
It's part of the legal framework, designed to ensure the system's integrity.
So, is there any flexibility?
Well, the prescribed manner is crucial, and it's about the government ensuring there's no ambiguity.
How does this compare to other countries?
It's a tricky thing to compare directly, you know? There's no precise equivalent.
So, this is uniquely Indian?
Chuckles, not precisely. But the specific chain renunciation is pretty unique.
How about exceptions?
Exceptions are possible, but it's rarely done. The process isn't flexible in the way a judge or an officer has flexibility when handling cases.
What are the implications of renouncing?
It's a definitive step, it's legally final.
An interesting perspective.
Absolutely. A thoughtful decision.
Can you give an example of a situation where someone might renounce their OCI?
Perhaps if they've developed stronger ties elsewhere, or have significant business interests abroad.
Makes sense.
It's a complex procedure.
So, the act of renunciation is crucial, and there are specific legal implications.
Exactly.
Lakshmikant, this has been extremely insightful.
Thanks, Vansh. Fascinating to discuss these things.
Lakshmikant, we've discussed how someone can choose to give up OCI status. Now, what if the government feels that someone should lose that status?
Well, the government can initiate cancellation procedures.
So, it's not always a choice by the individual?
No, that's correct. There are grounds for cancellation.
And what are those grounds?
Fraud, false representation, or concealing facts.
And what else?
Disaffection towards the Constitution, or unlawful trading during a war.
So, criticizing the government could be a trigger?
Not necessarily. But disaffection, a feeling of antagonism, potentially could be seen as a violation.
Wow, that's a bit subjective. What about imprisonment?
A sentence of 2 years or more within 5 years of registration.
Interesting. So, imprisonment becomes a factor?
Yes. Or if it's in the interests of India's sovereignty or integrity.
So, very broad grounds there.
Indeed. But there's a need to protect national interest.
What about the process? Is there due process?
There are procedures, yes, but they aren't as transparent as in criminal trials.
So, there's potential for unfairness?
A concern, perhaps.
What about specific cases you've seen or heard?
Difficult to discuss private cases.
What about international comparisons? Do other countries have similar measures?
Not precisely the same. Some countries have similar broad powers but with greater emphasis on due process.
So, this is a uniquely nuanced approach?
Perhaps. The process balances national security concerns with the rights of the individual.
Balancing act for sure.
Indeed. Very delicate.
Lakshmikant, this has been incredibly insightful.
Thanks, Vansh. It's rewarding to unpack these nuances.
Appreciate the clarity. Lakshmikant, let's move on to something fundamental. The Indian Constitution. It's the bedrock of everything. What are the fundamental rights, and how do they relate to our previous conversation?
Absolutely. Fundamental rights are the cornerstones of Indian democracy. They protect individual liberties.
So, how broad are these rights?
Very broad, covering everything from equality and freedom to cultural and religious rights. They're really a comprehensive safety net.
So, they're like the rules of engagement for the government?
Precisely. They limit the government's power and prevent authoritarianism.
Interesting. What about the justiciable part? Like, can you actually enforce them?
Yes, justiciable rights can be enforced through courts. It's a key aspect of how the system works.
Okay, so, what are the main categories? You mentioned equality and freedom.
Right, equality, freedom of speech, religion, against exploitation, cultural rights.
Wow. Quite a list. Has that list changed since the Constitution was written?
Yes, interestingly, the right to property was later removed from the fundamental rights list. That was an amendment.
What caused that change?
Well, there was a shift in priorities. It's a complex discussion about the balance between individual property rights and broader economic policies.
So, fundamental rights aren't static?
Not at all. They evolve with the times and with court interpretations.
And what about cases, real-world cases?
There are many, some related to free speech, some related to equality. You know, they can be very nuanced.
How does this link to our discussion on OCI?
These rights apply to everyone, including OCI cardholders, offering a crucial layer of protection.
That's great to know. Really helps put the pieces together.
It really does.
Thanks for clarifying that for me.
My pleasure.